Step away from the cabinet.
What? Who are you?
Seminole County Sheriff's Office. We have a warrant.
A warrant for what? I don't understand. Can someone please tell me what's going on?
Ma'am, we need you to come with us right now.
Come with you where? I have clients. I'm in the middle of...
Ma'am,
Within 48 hours of this footage, investigators would seize bank records documenting over 520 separate fraudulent transactions. Transfers from neighborhood dues accounts straight into Elvira D. Johnson's personal checking. Rent payments. Car notes. Designer boutiques. Her children's college funds. 27 criminal charges. Over $2 million stolen. And more than 580 families who had been paying their HOA dues every single month, trusting that money was going toward pool repairs, landscaping, and community upkeep, would learn it had been going somewhere else entirely. For more than a decade, Elvira Johnson appeared to be exactly what Central Florida's working families needed, a detail-oriented, locally rooted manager who promised to treat every community like family. She had built that reputation from nothing. From a childhood shaped by poverty and absence. From library books and night shifts and quiet, relentless ambition. But on the morning of February 8, 2024, the full truth of what she had built, and what she had destroyed, finally came to light. Before this story goes any further, if you've ever paid HOA dues and never once thought to ask where that money actually goes, drop your answer in the comments right now. And if this channel isn't already on your subscriptions list, fix that. Stories like this one, real people, real money, real betrayal, land here every single week. The office of Johnson Property Services was not an impressive place. A modest one-room suite tucked into a strip plaza off State Road 434 in Winter Springs, it looked like the kind of business that kept quiet hours and drew little attention from the neighboring insurance broker and nail salon. There was a desk. A filing cabinet. A laptop. Framed copies of professional certifications on the wall. Nothing about the room suggested that more than $2 million had flowed through it under false pretenses over the previous decade. At 9:47 on the morning of February 8, 2024, Detective James Caldwell of the Seminole County Sheriff's Financial Crimes Unit arrived at that door with a signed warrant and 2 uniformed deputies at his side. Inside, Elvira Johnson stood at the open filing cabinet with a manila folder still in her hand, unaware that everything was already over. The detective's command was measured and immediate. The folder froze mid-reach. Her eyes moved to the open laptop on the desk, then back to Caldwell, and for a moment, a brief, suspended moment, the professional composure that had carried her through 10 years of board meetings and budget presentations and community events held. Then it didn't. Her confusion was genuine or performed, or some combination of both. She demanded explanations, asked for clarification, looked to the deputies as though one of them might intervene on her behalf. None of it changed anything. At 9:51 a.m. the handcuffs clicked closed. At 9:53 she was walked through the front door of her own business past the shocked faces of neighboring tenants and placed in the back of a marked Seminole County patrol car. Her booking photograph was taken at 10:42. The woman in it looked exhausted rather than afraid, as though some weight she had been carrying for years had finally, quietly, set her down. Within 48 hours, investigators would seize bank records that told the full story in cold numerical detail. 520 separate fraudulent transactions. Over $2 million, $2,899,326, to be precise, transferred out of the reserve accounts and operating funds of 2 Central Florida homeowners associations over the course of nearly 10 years. Payments directly to her landlord. Transfers to her children's college savings accounts. Charges at luxury boutiques and high-end car dealerships. Tuition payments. Personal credit card bills. The money that hundreds of families had sent in every quarter, for landscaping, pool maintenance, community insurance, roof repairs, had been going somewhere else entirely. 27 felony charges. 2 devastated communities. And one question that would take months of investigation, a guilty plea, and a packed Seminole County courtroom to fully answer: how had this gone on for so long? The answer begins not in that strip plaza office, and not with the moment the detective walked through the door, but 24 years earlier, in a neighborhood on the edge of Orlando where the power went out more than once a month and the name Elvira Johnson meant absolutely nothing to anyone. She was born in 1980 into the kind of household that teaches children very early what scarcity looks like. The neighborhood sat on the unremarkable margins of Orlando, the kind of place that the city's booming tourism economy passed over entirely, a place of second-hand furniture and disconnected utilities and a particular kind of silence that falls over a home when the adults have run out of solutions. Her father disappeared when she was 7, his departure preceded by years of neglect and intermittent verbal abuse that left her mother depleted and left his daughter largely invisible to the world outside their front door. Teachers noticed her only enough to describe her as quiet. Neighbors saw through her. She occupied the back of classrooms and the edges of hallways without apparent friction, the kind of child institutional systems are designed to process rather than recognize. She was, by every external measure, an underdog, unremarkable in the eyes of the people responsible for her development, unremarkable in the eyes of the community around her. What none of them saw was what she was doing in the public library after school. By the time she was 12, Elvira Johnson had taught herself bookkeeping from library volumes she renewed week after week. She balanced her mother's checkbook with the same deliberate care that other children might apply to a school project, column by column, line by line, the household's thin finances laid out and reconciled while the adults around her remained too exhausted to look. It was a private discipline, invisible to everyone, carried out in the back of the apartment with the kind of self-taught precision that had no proper audience. That quiet, almost supernatural relationship with numbers, the ability to look at a column of figures and understand immediately what it meant and what it concealed, would become the defining instrument of her life. She graduated high school in 1998 with decent grades and no scholarship. Community college followed, part-time, the kind of enrollment that fits around necessity rather than ambition. To keep pace with it, she took night shifts answering phones at a property management company in Altamonte Springs, the kind of entry-level position that comes with access to everything and authority over nothing. For 4 years she watched. She watched monthly dues checks arrive from dozens of neighborhoods. She watched maintenance invoices go out and reserve funds accumulate. She watched spreadsheets compiled and annual reports mailed to homeowners who, as far as she could observe, almost never read them. What she was seeing, without yet fully understanding what she would one day do with the knowledge, was a system built almost entirely on assumed trust, hundreds of thousands of dollars per year flowing through accounts monitored by no one with any particular reason to look closely. By 2005 she had completed her associate degree. By 2006 she held her Florida Community Association manager license, the credential required to run an HOA management operation in the state. Her supervisors described her as detail-oriented and immediately trustworthy, the kind of professional who made anxious board members feel that nothing was going to slip through the cracks. Homeowners appreciated her calm, methodical explanations at meetings. She had a gift for it, the particular professional composure of someone who had spent years observing other people's problems from a quiet distance. In 2010 she made the decision that would define the following 14 years of her life. She incorporated Johnson Property Services LLC, a one-person operation run from that same modest office on State Road 434 in Winter Springs. The pitch she brought to prospective clients was straightforward and effective. She was local, she was responsive, and she actually cared. Unlike the large corporate firms that managed communities from a remove, she would know every board member by name, attend every meeting, answer her phone on weekends. It worked. Within 2 years she held contracts with 4 homeowners associations across Seminole County. By 2014, annual management fees exceeded $220,000. She bought a townhouse, enrolled her 2 children in good schools, and appeared to everyone who knew her as the ultimate expression of a particular Central Florida story, the overlooked girl who had quietly built something real and lasting on nothing but her own ability. No one suspected a thing. No one noticed the first transfer. To understand exactly what Elvira Johnson did, and why it took nearly a decade to catch her, it is necessary to understand how Florida's homeowners associations actually function, and why that structure made what followed not just possible but almost inevitable. Florida operates more than 50,000 community associations, more than any other state in the country. In Seminole County alone, hundreds of subdivisions and planned communities run on mandatory quarterly dues that residents have no legal option to withhold. Paul Hurlburt, a 420-home community in Winter Springs, collected between $290 and $425 per home each quarter depending on the lot, a total annual intake of over $600,000 designated for landscaping contracts, insurance premiums, reserve funds, pool maintenance, and the management company's fee. The board overseeing those accounts consisted of 5 volunteer residents, accountants, nurses, retired professionals. They were not negligent people. They were people operating under the reasonable assumption, the assumption the entire system is built upon, that the manager they had hired was doing what managers were supposed to do. Most had never seen an independent audit of the association's books. Most did not read the monthly bank statements in anything beyond the most cursory fashion. The statements were long, the line items numerous, the explanations provided by their manager always calm and comprehensive. When the manager was honest, the system functioned exactly as designed. When the manager was Elvira Johnson, that system became something else entirely. He arrived in Paul Hurlburt the way most retirees arrive in a new subdivision, quietly, without ceremony, carrying boxes and a forwarding address and the particular grief of a man who had recently lost the person he had built everything around. Leonard Hargrove was 67 years old, soft-spoken, recently widowed, and entirely unknown to the neighbors who watched the moving truck from their driveways in the autumn of 2022. He had come to Winter Springs to be closer to his grandchildren. He had not come looking for a fight. The neighborhood received him with the polite indifference most established communities extend to newcomers. He was invited to his first board meeting the following month, took a seat near the back, and listened. What he heard was professionally delivered, well-paced, and, to his trained ear, incomplete. He asked, politely, for supporting documentation on 2 line items in the operating budget. The request was acknowledged, deferred, and quietly buried beneath the more pressing business of parking enforcement and holiday decoration policy. The manager who fielded his question did so with a calm, practiced smile that gave nothing away. He returned the following month. He asked again. This time the other board members exchanged the kind of glances that pass between people who have already decided what they think of someone. The new retiree from up north. The paranoid one. The kind of man who reads terms and conditions for leisure. The manager thanked him for his engagement and assured the room that all relevant documentation was being compiled and would be distributed in due course. What no one in that room knew, what Leonard had long since stopped announcing about himself, having learned at considerable personal cost that the information rarely helped, was that he had spent 35 years as a forensic accountant hunting exactly the kind of irregularities that polished presentations were designed to conceal. He had blown the whistle once before, at a mid-sized corporate firm in the Northeast, and the experience had cost him his position and a significant portion of his professional standing before the investigation ultimately proved him right. He had learned from that episode not to speak loudly about what he suspected. He had learned to gather first, and speak only once. In January 2023 he submitted a formal written request, addressed to the board and the management company, for complete bank statements covering the previous 5 years. The request cited Florida Statute 720, which grants HOA members the legal right to inspect association financial records. It was delivered certified mail. The response was a smile and a promise. Documents were coming soon. There were formatting issues to resolve. The holidays had created a backlog. Soon. Leonard Hargrove did not wait for soon. He went to the bank directly, presenting his legal standing as an association member with statutory inspection rights. What he was handed across that counter took him the better part of a quiet afternoon to work through, and by the time he finished, the particular stillness that descends on a person who has just confirmed what they already suspected had settled over him completely. The records told a story that had no innocent explanation. Hundreds of transfers to Johnson Property Services, beyond the contracted management fee, with no corresponding invoices, no board authorization, no supporting documentation of any kind. Credit card charges at luxury retailers in amounts far exceeding anything the association's budget had ever allocated for community events. Rent payments wired repeatedly to an apartment complex in Altamonte Springs. Car payments to a Mercedes dealership in the county. Private school tuition. And in a single calendar year, more than $68,000 charged to a single jewelry store. He assembled the records into a presentation the way he had assembled dozens of investigative findings over the course of his career, not dramatically, but methodically, with dates and amounts and the gaps where documentation should have existed and did not. He called an emergency board meeting. He arrived early, set his materials on the table, and waited. The other members arrived expecting a procedural dispute. What they received, delivered in the same unhurried, factual register that Leonard applied to everything, was a decade of financial betrayal laid out in columns and totals and undeniable arithmetic. The professional composure in the room dissolved gradually, then all at once. Board members who had smiled at Elvira Johnson across those same tables for years sat in silence as the full shape of what had happened came into focus. The vote to terminate Johnson Property Services was unanimous. Every password was changed the same evening. Every access card was revoked. The Seminole County Sheriff's Office received the call before midnight. As the truth began to surface in these quiet winter-spring subdivisions, one question lingered in the air: have you ever actually looked at where your own HOA dues go each quarter? If this story has you wondering whether your neighborhood books would hold up to scrutiny, type "audit time" in the comments, or share this with a neighbor who pays dues every month. The case was assigned to Detective James Caldwell of the Financial Crimes Unit, and what he uncovered in the weeks following the initial complaint went considerably further than even Leonard's meticulous presentation had suggested. The search of Elvira's office computer produced what experienced investigators rarely encounter: a record keeper's confession. The file was named simply "Private Ledger." It cataloged every fraudulent transaction across the full span of the scheme, dates, amounts, which association had been the source, and brief personal annotations that transformed a financial document into something closer to a private diary. Notes like "kids soccer" and "new tires" and "trip deposit" appeared alongside figures that corresponded exactly to the unexplained withdrawals Leonard had identified in the bank records. The precision was remarkable. She had tracked it all, every dollar, with the same discipline she had once applied to her mother's household accounts in a rundown Orlando apartment at the age of 12. But Detective Caldwell found something else, something the initial complaint had not anticipated and the investigation had not been looking for. A secondary tab within the same spreadsheet, titled "Redemption Plan," written in a different register entirely. In it, Elvira had logged the running total of everything taken alongside private written reflections that returned repeatedly to the same themes: her childhood, the scarcity, the invisibility, the belief that systems were designed to overlook people like her. She had recorded her intention to repay every dollar once her children completed their education. To make things right, she had written, for the next generation of underdogs like she had once been. It was not a legal defense. It was not exculpatory in any sense that would matter before a judge. But it added a psychological dimension to the case that even the prosecutor's office acknowledged quietly. This had not been the work of a person who felt nothing. It had been the work of a person who had built an elaborate justification, warped, self-serving, and sustained across a decade, that allowed her to look at 520 fraudulent transactions and still, in some private internal accounting, consider herself one of the victims. The investigation expanded to Joe M. Jenkins. The pattern was identical. Another $900,000 drained through the same playbook: fake vendors, personal expenses folded into community accounts, reserve funds quietly hollowed out while amenities deteriorated and homeowners paid their quarterly dues without complaint. Detective Caldwell interviewed families from both communities over the following weeks. He heard the same story in different rooms: faithful payments, deteriorating infrastructure, confident assurances from a manager they had trusted completely. The pool. The roofs. The landscaping contracts that were billed and never completed. The special assessments that arrived without warning and hit household budgets that had not been prepared for them. The warrant was signed on February 6, 2024. 2 days of preparation followed, methodical and unhurried, in the manner of a case that had already been won on paper and needed only to be formally closed. On the morning of February 8, 2024, Winter Springs was unremarkable. The strip plaza on State Road 434 had been open for less than an hour when Detective Caldwell and 2 uniformed deputies pulled into the parking lot at 9:43. They moved without urgency, the kind of deliberate calm that experienced law enforcement carries into situations that have already been resolved in every meaningful sense before the first knock. Inside, Elvira Johnson was standing at the filing cabinet with a manila folder in her hand, operating in the ordinary rhythm of a workday she had no reason to believe was different from any other. The door opened. She turned. What followed took 4 minutes. Her professional composure, the same composure that had carried her through 10 years of board meetings and budget presentations and difficult questions deflected with patient smiles, fractured in stages as the reality of the warrant, the deputies, and the detectives measured instructions registered in sequence. She looked at the laptop. She looked at the door. She looked for the version of events in which this was a misunderstanding that her calm, authoritative manner could resolve. There was no such version. The handcuffs closed at 9:51. At 9:53 she was walked through the front entrance of her own office past the stunned faces of neighboring tenants and guided into the back of a marked patrol car. Her booking photograph was taken at 10:42 at the Seminole County Jail. The woman in the image looked neither defiant nor destroyed. She looked, above everything else, like someone who had finally stopped performing. 27 felony charges were filed by the Seminole County State Attorney's Office on February 12. The indictment was extensive and specific: grand theft exceeding $100,000, organized scheme to defraud, multiple counts of fraud involving financial transactions, false statements. Elvira's attorney moved aggressively in the early months, motions to suppress the search results, arguments that certain transfers had been legitimate fees miscategorized in the reporting, challenges to the warrant's scope. Every motion failed. The private ledger spreadsheet was in her name, on her computer, annotated in her own language. The redemption plan tab, far from offering mitigation, demonstrated the calculated and sustained nature of the scheme in terms no defense argument could convincingly reframe. When prosecutors indicated they were prepared to present victim impact statements from families across both communities, the negotiations shifted. In August 2024, Elvira Johnson entered a guilty plea to the major counts. The remaining charges were resolved in the agreement. Sentencing was held in October. The courtroom in Sanford was full. They had come from both communities, from Paul Hurlburt and from Joe M. Jenkins, from two subdivisions that had never had particular reason to know each other before a shared betrayal brought them to the same room. They filled every available seat and stood where seats had run out, and the weight of their collective presence was not loud or theatrical. It was simply dense, the way rooms become dense when the people inside them have been waiting a long time for something that cannot be undone but must nevertheless be said. Evelyn Thompson was 71 years old and had retired from teaching elementary school after 30 years in Seminole County classrooms. She had paid her HOA dues for 14 consecutive years without missing a quarter, had attended community meetings, had assumed, as most people assume, that her consistent good faith was being met with equal good faith on the other side of the ledger. A special assessment had arrived 2 years earlier, unexpected, substantial, representing costs that adequate reserves would have covered entirely, and she had taken out a reverse mortgage on her home to pay it. She described this to the court without drama, in the factual register of a person who has already processed the worst of it and is now simply providing testimony. 14 years of payments. 1 reverse mortgage. A home she had expected to leave to her children, now encumbered. The Reynolds family sat together near the center aisle. They were young, a toddler and a newborn between them, both children too small to understand where they were or why. The husband described in measured terms the sequence of events that had led them to sell their house at a loss, the deteriorating amenities, the assessments, the creeping sense that the neighborhood they had bought into was not being maintained but merely administered, and the eventual calculation that staying was no longer financially rational. They had trusted the manager. They had seen her at block parties. She had smiled at their children. Harold Bennett was 84 and attended in a jacket that still carried the particular pressed quality of a man who had learned discipline in the Navy and never entirely lost the habit. He had served 30 years. He had retired to Paul Hurlburt because it was quiet and had a community pool he used every morning without exception until the pool fell into disrepair and the repair funds turned out not to exist. He addressed the court from his seat, and the room was absolutely still while he spoke. Judge Rebecca Thornton had presided over financial crime cases for 11 years. Her sentencing remarks were not long, and they were not delivered for effect. She spoke directly to Elvira Johnson about the nature of the position she had held, not an elected office, not a corporate role, but something more intimate and more binding than either, a position built entirely on the willingness of ordinary people to extend trust to someone they had chosen to manage the place where they lived. The dues, she noted, were not voluntary. Florida law required homeowners to pay them. There was no opt-out, no alternative, no recourse except to move, and so those families had no choice but to trust whoever held the accounts. That trust had been treated as an instrument of extraction for 10 years. The gavel came down. 15 years in the Florida Department of Corrections. 12 years of supervised probation to follow. Full restitution, $2,899,326. Elvira Johnson showed no visible response as the sentence was recorded. She was remanded to custody and transported to Lowell Correctional Institution before the afternoon was out. Her earliest possible release date is 2036. For weeks later, the homeowners of Paul Hurlburt and Joe Jenkins gathered for a joint town hall in a community room that smelled faintly of coffee and folding chairs. The new management company presented the financial reality without softening it: reserve funds nearly depleted, major structural repairs deferred across both communities for years, a recovery timeline measured not in months but in the better part of a decade. The room absorbed this information in silence of a different quality than the courtrooms, not the silence of reckoning, but the silence of people recalibrating. Near the end of the meeting, Leonard Hargrove stood. He did not speak at length. He was not a man who found value in length when brevity would carry the same weight. He said that they had trusted someone they should not have trusted, and that this was a true thing, and that it had cost them. He said that they had caught her, and held her accountable, in the way that systems are supposed to work when someone inside them refuses to stay invisible. He said that now they would rebuild, together, the way people who have been through something together are capable of rebuilding. He sat down. The meeting continued. No one in either of those two communities will look at an HOA financial report the same way again, not the ones who were there from the beginning, not the ones who arrived after, not the ones who paid faithfully every quarter for 14 years and assumed, because it seemed reasonable to assume, that someone was watching the money. The assumption was not foolish. It was simply, in this case, wrong. And in the gap between that assumption and the reality of what Elvira Johnson had done with it, nearly $3 million disappeared, one quiet transfer at a time, across 10 years, in a modest office on a strip plaza in Winter Springs where the framed certifications still hung on the wall.